He secured 5 championship rings while hunting within the same purple and gold borders for 20 relentless years. He once choked under the lights of Utah with 4 airballs, only to incinerate the record books with 81 points a decade later. He stood back up on a ruptured Achilles, staring into the abyss of agony to sink 2 final free throws. He was once the most reviled villain in professional sports, yet he died the undisputed martyr of a global generation. He is the man who turned psychological obsession into a lethal art form. On Kobe Bryant, do you know? Why did he master the technical precision of tap dancing just to fortify the smallest bones in his feet? Why did he systematically erase his own parents from his life, treating a family bloodline like a failed business contract? Why did he force his teammates to endure 100-point games in practice until their spirits were physically broken? Why did he choose to commute by helicopter through the lethal fog of California just to reclaim 20 minutes of silence with his daughters? The identity of Kobe Bryant began as a deliberate biological and cultural intersection established long before he ever touched a leather ball in a Philadelphia driveway. His father, Joe Bryant, stood as a 6'9" blueprint of the modern positionless player. While navigating 8 seasons in the NBA with the Philadelphia 76ers, San Diego Clippers, and Houston Rockets, the elder Bryant was defined by a stylistic anomaly known as jelly bean. He possessed the rhythmic, almost sugary fluidity of a playground guard, trapped within the substantial frame of a power forward. This professional profile, built on ball-handling grace and a nimble navigation of the hardwood, was decades ahead of its time. It was this genetic architecture that ensured the younger Bryant would not merely inherit height, but a specific type of kinetic intelligence, a perimeter-oriented dexterity that allowed a large frame to operate with surgical precision on the third blacktop. Yet, if the father provided the physical canvas, the mother supplied the primary colors of his obsession. Pamela Cox Bryant was herself a product of a distinct basketball lineage. Her brother, John "Chubby" Cox, had carved out his own territory in the NBA, reinforcing a family culture where the sport was treated not as a recreational pursuit, but as a sovereign mandate. Pamela functioned as the family's stern architect, a woman whose influence manifested as an uncompromising demand for focus and competitive stoicism. She was the one who curated the environment of relentless self-correction, ensuring that the middle-class comforts of the Bryant household never softened the boys' ambition. In this house, basketball was the primary syntax of their communication, a shared language that bypassed the need for traditional domestic sentiment. He was the youngest child, the only son, and the focus of a concentrated parental investment that viewed his potential as a project of generational refinement. The naming of the child in 1978 was a moment of sharp, exotic branding that hinted at a life destined for distinction. While dining at a Philadelphia restaurant, Joe and Pamela noticed Kobe beef on the menu. The word possessed a sharp, exotic resonance that appealed to their desire for a name that would not blend into the background. They paired it with Bean, a direct nod to Joe's own moniker, creating a name that functioned as a unique linguistic marker. This was not a name designed for a mundane existence. It was an early declaration of a life intended to stand apart from the collective. Within this tight-knit, sports-centric infrastructure, the boys' developmental years were insulated from the softening effects of unearned praise. The living room often functioned as a classroom where the entertainment value of basketball was stripped away. Joe utilized his professional experience to deconstruct game tapes, forcing the boy to watch not for the thrill of the highlight, but for the forensic deconstruction of defensive rotations. The early instruction was not about the joy of the game, but about the architecture of a tactical solution. The transition from the sprawling asphalt of Philadelphia to the ancient limestone quiet of Rieti was a violent displacement of the senses. At age 6, the boy was thrust into an environment where his primary identity was rendered mute. In the shadow of the Apennine Mountains, he became an ethnographic curiosity, a solitary African-American child navigating a landscape of cobblestones and centuries-old Catholic architecture. The linguistic barrier was absolute, creating a psychological vacuum that transformed his childhood into an extended exercise in observation. In this silence, the boy did not seek comfort. He sought a medium of translation. He found it in the rhythmic cadence of the basketball, a tool that bypassed the need for Italian vowels. The court became his private laboratory, the only geography where the rules were universal, and his physical competence acted as his primary syntax. While the basketball court provided a sanctuary for his mind, the soccer pitch provided the structural innovations for his body. In the Italian youth sports ecosystem, the divisions between disciplines were porous, and the boy spent thousands of hours operating as a goalkeeper and a midfielder. This was the unrecognized forge of his future dominance. In the pursuit of the soccer ball, he mastered the complex mechanics of lower body navigation. The pitch demanded a hyper-focus on the center of gravity, teaching him how to shift his weight with a lateral burst and how to plant his lead foot with a predator's timing. He learned the geometry of the pitch, how to narrow an angle and anticipate a trajectory long before the ball reached its destination. This cross-training inadvertently sharpened a spatial awareness that was invisible to his American peers, but would later manifest as a lethal, phantom-like agility in the post. To him, the hardwood was merely a compressed version of the grass field, a space to be manipulated through the precise orchestration of his feet. The instruction he received in these provincial gymnasiums was defined by a rigid, almost monasticism. European coaches viewed the game not as a theater for individual expression, but as a series of skeletal mechanical problems. Under their dogmatic scrutiny, the boy was subjected to a relentless curriculum of fundamental. Dunking was frequently forbidden, viewed as a vulgar shortcut that bypassed the necessity of technical mastery. Instead, he was forced into the repetitive drudgery of the shooting pocket and the subtle physics of the triple threat stance. He spent entire afternoons practicing the left-handed layup, a mechanical correction intended to erase the biological bias of his dominant side. Every movement was broken down into its constituent parts, from the angle of the wrist to the micro-adjustments of the trial step at the baseline. This was an industrial education, a process of stripping the game of its American flash and replacing it with a cold, functional sophistication. The boy's connection to his homeland survived through a singular flickering medium, grainy VHS tapes sent across the Atlantic by his grandfather. These recordings of Magic Johnson and Larry Bird were not viewed as entertainment, but as sacred text. In the solitude of his room, the boy performed a forensic analysis of the screen, mirroring the movements of the gods until they were ingrained in his muscle memory. He did not merely watch the games, he inhabited them. He began a rigorous correspondence with his grandfather, sending letters that bypassed typical adolescent sentiment to focus on the cold realities of the game. These were not letters from a grandchild, but scouting reports from an apprentice architect. He analyzed the strategic flaws of the Lakers and the Celtics, dissecting defensive rotations and offensive inefficiencies with a detached, surgical clarity. He sat at a small wooden desk, the flicker of the television reflected in his eyes, as he transcribed the movements of a world he would soon return to conquer. He folded the latest letter, the ink still fresh on the paper, and looked out the window at the darkening Italian hills, his mind already thousands of miles away on a court he had yet to claim. The Philadelphia that greeted 13-year-old Kobe Bryant was a landscape of stark contrasts, a visceral shock of urban grit compared to the limestone serenity of provincial Italy. He arrived as a linguistic hybrid, his English colored by a faint melodic lilt that rendered him an outsider once again. But unlike the silence of Reggio Emilia, the blacktops of Lower Merion demanded a vocal and physical assertion of dominance. He stepped onto the court not to integrate, but to colonize. The technical sophistication he had acquired in the European gymnasiums, the footwork of a soccer midfielder, and the shooting mechanics of a monastic apprentice felt alien to the raw athletic environment of American high school basketball. He moved with a clinical economy that his peers initially mistook for hesitation, but which was in fact a superior form of spatial intelligence. Within months, the Italian accent faded, replaced by the universal language of the scoreboard. He began an assault on the history books, eventually amassing 2,883 points, eclipsing the legendary high school scoring record held for decades by Wilt Chamberlain. This was not merely a collection of statistics. It was a systematic dismantling of the city's athletic hierarchy. The dominance was fueled by a pathological routine that bordered on the ascetic. While the suburbs of Philadelphia remained shrouded in the pre-dawn winter frost, Bryant was already active, the rhythmic thud of a ball echoing in empty gymnasiums at 5 o'clock in the morning. This was his 0 hour, a daily ritual intended to secure a psychological advantage before the sun reached the horizon. He did not seek teammates. He sought subjects. He would frequently force his peers into grueling one-on-one sessions, a form of Darwinian basketball where the game did not conclude at a conventional score. He demanded they play until he had reached a 100-point lead, a relentless exercise in mental and physical exhaustion. These sessions were not designed for mutual improvement. They were designed to break the will of the opposition and to confirm his own capacity for sustained, agonizing focus. To Bryant, the court was a theater of Darwinian selection, and he was the sole apex predator. As his reputation expanded beyond the gym walls, he began to inhabit the intersection of athletic brilliance and cultural celebrity. In 1996, he invited the R&B singer Brandy to the Lower Merion Senior Prom, a move that functioned as a choreographed introduction to the American public. Amidst the flashing bulbs of local news cameras, he occupied the spotlight with a composed, almost detached confidence, signaling that he was already preparing for a stage far larger than a high school gymnasium. Despite the mounting fame, the core of his education remained private and domestic. His father, Joe, remained a constant, hovering presence, occupying the spaces near the Lower Merion campus to facilitate a continuous cycle of preparation. They spent hours together in darkened rooms, the flicker of the television illuminating their faces as they deconstructed professional game film. Joe functioned as a forensic consultant, stripping away the aesthetics of the NBA to reveal the underlying structural flaws of its veterans. This was a sophisticated apprenticeship, a strategic bypass of the traditional collegiate system. The decision to skip college was the logical conclusion of this decade-long industrialization of his talent. By the age of 18, Bryant was no longer a student-athlete in the conventional sense. He was a finished product, a specialized instrument of basketball efficiency. He stood at the threshold of the professional world with the technical vocabulary of a veteran and the hunger of an exile returning to claim his throne. The final days in Philadelphia were defined by a quiet, vibrating intensity. He moved through the halls of Lower Merion as a visitor who had already departed, his mind fixed on the professional arenas where the stakes would finally match his internal pressure. He walked out of the school gymnasium for the last time, the heavy doors thudding shut behind him, leaving the record-shattering echoes of his youth in the silence of the empty hall. He stood in the parking lot, the cold Pennsylvania air sharp in his lungs, looking toward a horizon that was no longer a distant prospect, but a waiting reality. The intersection of destiny and institutional risk occurred in a sequestered gymnasium in 1996, where Jerry West, the clinical architect of the Los Angeles Lakers, witnessed something that defied the conventional scouting metrics of the era. The 18-year-old Bryant was not merely a physical specimen. He was a psychological predator. West watched as the teenager dismantled seasoned professionals in a series of private workouts with a detached, rhythmic brutality. It was not the shooting range or the verticality that captivated West, but the predatory focus in the boy's eyes, a chilling, singular frequency that suggested a refusal to acknowledge the existence of failure. West orchestrated a calculated gamble, trading established veteran Vlade Divac to Charlotte for the 13th pick, a move that the league initially viewed as a dangerous obsession with potential over proven stability. To West, however, the trade was not an investment in a player, but an investment in an inevitable force. Bryant entered Los Angeles as a curiosity, a teenage anomaly in a locker room of grown men, carrying the weight of a franchise that had forgotten how it felt to be at the center of the basketball universe. The baptism by fire arrived not in a moment of triumph, but through a spectacular public disintegration in the spring of 1997. In a deciding playoff game against the Utah Jazz, in the thin, suffocating air of Salt Lake City, the teenage Bryant demanded the burden of the final shots. What followed was a series of 3 airballs, catastrophic, arcing misses that failed to even graze the rim. The sound of the ball hitting nothing but air was amplified by the roaring derision of the Utah crowd. It was a failure of historic proportions, a moment designed to shatter the ego of a novice. Yet, as the Lakers flew back to Los Angeles in the silence of defeat, Bryant did not retreat into shame. Upon landing, while the city slept, he drove directly to a high school gymnasium in Pacific Palisades. He did not go to rest. He went to work. He spent the remainder of the night and the entirety of the following summer in a state of mechanical penance, launching thousands of jumpers until his shoulders ached and the mechanics of his release were burned into his nervous system. The airballs were not an end, but a necessary trauma that stripped away his last vestiges of adolescent softness, replacing them with a calloused, forensic commitment to perfection. By 1998, the student began to actively haunt the master. The All-Star Game in New York became the theater for a generational confrontation between Bryant and Michael Jordan. The narrative required a respectful passing of the torch, but Bryant arrived with a different intent. He sought a psychological autopsy of his idol. In one of the most polarizing sequences of the game, Bryant waved off a screen from Karl Malone, a legendary veteran, signaling his absolute refusal to utilize the tactical safety of a teammate. He wanted Jordan in isolation. He wanted to feel the physical pressure and the competitive heat of the man who occupied the throne he intended to seize. Jordan recognized the familiar pathology in the younger man. The same refusal to defer, the same hunger for the jugular. This was the beginning of a clandestine apprenticeship that existed outside the view of the media. Bryant began contacting Jordan at impossible hours, frequently initiating phone calls at 2 o'clock in the morning to discuss the minutiae of low-post footwork or the psychological manipulation of a defensive rotation. He was not looking for a mentor. He was looking for the secret frequency of greatness. The dynamic between the two men shifted from rivalry to a profound, unspoken kinship. Jordan, known for his caustic isolation, found in Bryant a younger brother who shared his specific, agonizing brand of competitive insomnia. These late-night exchanges were a laboratory of elite performance, where the mechanics of the game were dissected with the precision of a surgical procedure. Bryant was collecting data, archiving every nuance of Jordan's movement and mentality, essentially performing a slow-motion heist of the greatest basketball mind in history. He moved through the league with an increasing arrogance, a confidence derived from the knowledge that he was the only player in the world who possessed the full curriculum of the Jordan era. The 1996 draft pick was no longer a gamble. It was a looming reality that the NBA was unprepared to contain. He stood on the court with his chin tilted upward, the lights of the arena reflecting a cold, absolute certainty. The ghosts of the Utah airballs had been replaced by a silence that was far more terrifying to his opponents. The silence of a predator who had finally mastered the rhythm of the kill. The dawn of the new millennium saw the Los Angeles Lakers ascend to a position of historical dominance, yet the internal architecture of the dynasty was vibrating with a structural instability. Under the tactical zen of Phil Jackson, the team secured 3 consecutive championships, but the locker room functioned as a theater of irreconcilable ideologies. At the center of this friction were Shaquille O'Neal and Kobe Bryant, a partnership defined by a catastrophic contrast in human nature. O'Neal was the physical embodiment of effortless genius, a giant who viewed the game through a prism of hedonism and charismatic levity. To O'Neal, the championship was a reward for his natural-born dominance. To Bryant, the championship was a baseline requirement, a goal that demanded a monastic, punishing adherence to the craft. Bryant viewed O'Neal's periodic relaxation as a desecration of the game, while O'Neal viewed Bryant's asceticism as a clinical antisocial disorder. The tension frequently manifested as a raw, physical aggression, culminating in locker room confrontations where the verbal vitriol threatened to eclipse the physical achievements on the court. It was a power game of total exhaustion. Bryant was no longer content to be the gifted apprentice. He sought to seize the helm of the franchise, viewing O'Neal's casual brilliance as the primary obstacle to a more disciplined, perfect version of the Lakers. Amidst this professional warfare, Bryant sought a private sanctuary that would ultimately cost him his ancestral ties. In 1999, while wandering through the corridors of a recording studio, the 21-year-old Bryant encountered Vanessa Lane, a 17-year-old high school student. The impact was instantaneous and categorical. To Bryant, Vanessa represented a domestic frontier that was entirely his own, a territory insulated from the relentless scrutiny of the NBA and the dogmatic expectations of his parents. They were engaged within 6 months, a rapid escalation that signaled Bryant's desire to establish a sovereign life. However, this romantic autonomy was viewed as a betrayal by Joe and Pamela Bryant. They harbored deep-seated objections to Vanessa's background and the precocity of the union, viewing the marriage not as an expansion of the family, but as a fracture in its carefully curated foundation. The disapproval was not a private disagreement. It was a total severance of the diplomatic lines that had sustained Bryant since his childhood in Italy. The wedding in 2001 was a study in absolute isolation. Held at a small Catholic church, the ceremony was conspicuously devoid of the usual trappings of professional athletic celebrity. There were no teammates in the pews. The Lakers roster, sensing the internal political volatility of the union, remained absent. More devastatingly, the pews reserved for the Bryant parents remained empty. Joe and Pamela chose to bypass the event entirely, a gesture of silent public condemnation that effectively orphaned Bryant from his past. The man who was currently conquering the basketball world found himself standing at the altar in a state of social desertion. This was the moment The umbilical cord was severed. Bryant did not retreat or seek reconciliation. Instead, he leaned into the isolation, utilizing the rejection as further fuel for his competitive pathology. The 3 championship rings he earned during this period were trophies won in a domestic vacuum. His parents refused to attend the games or acknowledge the hardware, treating the highest achievements of his professional life with a cold, calculated indifference. This period of his life was defined by a profound doubling of his identity. On the court, he was a soaring, indestructible component of a historic dynasty, draped in purple and gold and showered in the adulation of millions. Off the court, he was a man living in a self-imposed fortress, separated from his biological roots by a wall of unresolved resentment. He communicated with his parents through silence, a cold war of the ego that would persist for years. The letters that once carried technical dissections of NBA games were replaced by a void. Vanessa became his only confidant, the sole witness to the internal pressure that threatened to buckle the man behind the superstar mask. He moved through the world with a defensive arrogance, a psychological armor designed to protect the fragile domestic peace he had fought so violently to secure. He stood in the center of the Staples Center as the confetti fell for the 3rd time, the roar of the crowd reaching a deafening frequency. Yet his eyes betrayed a singular, haunting clarity. He had the rings, he had the girl, and he had the kingdom. But the seats where his story began remained vacant, a quiet testament to the price of his uncompromising autonomy. The summer of 2003 represented the total thermal death of the persona Kobe Bryant had meticulously constructed since his return from Italy. In a hotel room in Eagle, Colorado, the structural integrity of his life dissolved into a legal and social nightmare. The accusation of sexual assault transformed the golden child of the NBA into a cultural pariah overnight. The consequences were categorical and swift. Major corporate sponsors initiated a systematic erasure of his likeness from their campaigns, and the adulation of the American public was replaced by a visceral, televised vitriol. For the first time, Bryant was not fighting a defensive rotation or a rival superstar. He was fighting the machinery of the American judicial system and the looming threat of a permanent carceral silence. The man who had previously found safety in the predictable geometry of the basketball court now found himself trapped in a landscape of courtrooms and tabloid headlines where the rules were opaque and the stakes were existential. Under this crushing atmospheric pressure, Bryant's psyche underwent a radical, defensive mutation. He realized that the human being known as Kobe, the husband, the father, the son who had failed his parents, was too fragile to survive the dual weight of a criminal trial and a professional season. To preserve his sanity, he engineered a psychological firewall, a process of internal fracturing that birthed a secondary identity. Inspired by the lethal singular efficiency of the assassin in the cinema of Quentin Tarantino, he christened this alter ego the Black Mamba. This was not a marketing gimmick. It was a biological necessity. The Black Mamba was designed to be a cold-blooded instrument of execution, an entity capable of stripping away the noise of the trial and the shame of the scandal to focus entirely on the mechanics of the kill. When he stepped onto the court, he was no longer a man under indictment. He was a reptile, operating on a different evolutionary frequency, one where empathy and pain were deactivated in favor of a relentless, kinetic precision. The logistical reality of this period was an exhausting pantomime of endurance. Bryant spent his days in the sterile silence of a Colorado courtroom, absorbing the procedural indignities of the legal process, only to board a private jet and arrive at the arena minutes before tip-off. This oscillation between the role of the accused and the role of the apex predator created a dangerous, volatile energy. The court became his only venue of control, the only space where he could exert his will upon a world that was trying to dismantle him. He played with a desperate, scorched earth intensity, utilizing the game as a form of sensory deprivation. He was not playing for the fans or for the win. He was playing to drown out the internal voices of his own ruin. The arena was the only place where the Black Mamba could breathe, a high-altitude bunker where the variables were limited to the bounce of the ball and the movement of the defense. This psychological severance culminated on a January night in 2006 against the Toronto Raptors. The performance was not an act of sport. It was an 81-point exorcism. Bryant moved through the game in a state of clinical detachment, as if he were performing a high-speed autopsy on the opposing defense. He launched 46 shots with a mechanical indifference to the fatigue in his legs or the defensive schemes intended to slow him. Every basket was a calculated strike against his own perceived weakness, a way to reclaim a sense of safety through total, undeniable dominance. The 81 points represented the peak of the Mamba personality, a moment where the human ego was completely eclipsed by the cold requirements of the score. By the final whistle, he had authored the second highest scoring performance in the history of the game, not through joy, but through an agonizing pathological need to prove his own indestructibility. He walked off the floor as the crowd stood in a state of shocked reverence, his face an unreadable mask of exhaustion and defiance. He had survived the collapse of his reputation by becoming something less than human and more than a player, a creature of pure, focused intent who had found his salvation in the very violence of his own ambition. He sat in the locker room afterward, the ice packs taped to his joints like armor, staring at the stat sheet with a cold, terrifying clarity. The trial was over. The scandal had been buried under the weight of his points, but the man he used to be was gone, replaced forever by the serpent he had invited in to save him. By the mid-2000s, the preparation rituals of Kobe Bryant had mutated into a form of psychological and biological warfare that existed far beyond the boundaries of traditional athletic training. He viewed the game not as a sport, but as a complex system of variables that could be mastered through obsessive quantification. His day began at 4 o'clock in the morning, a timing chosen specifically for its symbolic and strategic weight. To Bryant, the darkness of the early morning was a theater of psychological dominance. He derived a predatory satisfaction from knowing that his opponents were still unconscious, losing ground with every minute of sleep. This was the foundation of his first strike mentality. He would frequently extend this aggression into the private lives of his rivals, initiating phone calls at 3 o'clock in the morning to discuss upcoming matchups, or to subtly remind them of his own wakefulness. These were not conversations, but strategic incursions designed to infiltrate the sleep cycles and the subconscious confidence of his peers, establishing a state of mental siege long before the first whistle of the game. In the silence of empty gymnasiums, Bryant engaged in a practice he termed shadow modeling, hours of intense, high-speed movement performed without a ball. He would navigate the court against invisible defenders, his body contorting and accelerating, as if reacting to phantom stimuli. He was building a mental library of every possible defensive rotation, mapping the hardwood until the geometry of the court was hardwired into his nervous system. This cognitive mapping allowed him to operate with a detached clarity during the chaos of live play, his mind already having processed the scenarios 1,000 times in the dark. To an observer, It was a pantomime of madness. To Bryant, it was the forensic engineering of certainty. His pursuit of efficiency led him toward a radical cross-disciplinary curriculum, looking past the world of basketball to find superior models of predation. He became a student of bionics, specifically the mechanics of the great white shark. He studied the shark's capacity for extreme patience, followed by a singular vertical strike from beneath the surface, translating the predator's energy conservation and explosive timing into his own offensive repertoire. He dissected the movement of the cheetah, analyzing how the feline adjusted its stride frequency and shifted its center of gravity during high-speed pursuits. He would spend hours observing the way these apex predators manipulated their own physics to minimize drag and maximize lethality, eventually incorporating these biomechanical insights into his footwork and lateral bursts. He was no longer just a basketball player. He was a biological architect, attempting to graft the most efficient traits of the natural world onto his own 6-foot, 6-inch frame. This obsession with marginal gains extended to the very infrastructure of the arena. Bryant approached the game with the precision of a ballistics expert, meticulously studying the blind spots created by the positioning of each official. He memorized the referee's manual, identifying the specific angles where their sightlines were obscured, allowing him to execute subtle, undetected infractions. A hand on a hip, a micro-nudge during a drive, that were invisible to the officiating crew, but devastating to his defender. He conducted a sensory audit of every arena in the league, cataloging the specific hardness of the hardwood floorboards and the minute discrepancies in lighting intensity. He understood that a floor with more give required a different adjustment in his leap, and that a slight glare from a specific overhead lamp could alter the perception of the rim's depth. He moved through the league as a forensic investigator, collecting data points that his opponents ignored until the entire environment of the NBA was under his psychological and physical control. He stood in the center of the court during pre-game warm-ups, his eyes scanning the rafters and the flooring, not in admiration, but in calculation. A predator measuring the cage to ensure that the kill would be absolute. The 2008 NBA Finals represented a visceral psychological amputation for Bryant. Losing to the Boston Celtics was not merely a professional failure. It was a rejection of his sovereign identity as the Black Mamba. In the aftermath of the crushing defeat, he responded with a clinical, almost violent purge of sentimental artifacts. He discarded every silver medal and runner-up commemorative item, viewing them not as symbols of achievement, but as forensic evidence of insufficiency. To Bryant, second place was a biological failure, the ultimate proof of being the leader of the losers. This period of mourning was silent and productive, a state of sustained fury that required a new type of tactical catalyst. The arrival of Pau Gasol provided the necessary variable. Bryant greeted the Spanish forward at 1 o'clock in the morning on his first night in Los Angeles, immediately initiating a psychological integration. He did not offer a standard welcome. He offered a mandate for excellence. Utilizing the linguistic remains of his European upbringing, Bryant began communicating with Gasol in Spanish on the court. This created an encrypted tactical language that allowed them to orchestrate offensive maneuvers in real time, effectively bypassing the defensive comprehension of their opponents. The Spanish dialogue served as a private frequency of dominance, turning Gasol into the perfect intellectual counterpart to Bryant's predatory ambition. As the years added layers of scar tissue to his career, the raw animosity of his youth began to evolve into a form of high-level diplomatic mercy. The most significant structural repair occurred with Shaquille O'Neal. The two men, once defined by a mutually assured destruction of the ego, entered a phase of retrospective reconciliation. In a televised sit-down, the vitriol of the early 2000s was replaced by a cold, analytical regret. Bryant acknowledged the missed opportunities of their fractured partnership, admitting that a more mature version of their collective will could have secured a dozen championships. This was not a sentimental apology. It was a rational audit of a lost empire. He moved from viewing O'Neal as an obstacle to viewing him as a legendary peer, a shift that signaled Bryant's ascent into a historical perspective where his legacy was no longer threatened by the brilliance of others. This mercy was the final component of his leadership, the realization that true power included the capacity to acknowledge the strength of a former enemy. However, this newfound mercy did not extend to the financial dependency of his own biological family. Bryant applied the same Darwinian logic of the basketball court to his domestic infrastructure. In a move that sent shockwaves through his immediate circle, he terminated the direct economic support of his two sisters, Shariah and Shaya. To Bryant, the act of giving money was not an act of love, but an act of institutional softening. He viewed their financial reliance as a structural flaw that prevented them from achieving their own individual autonomy. He replaced unconditional handouts with a rigorous philosophy of investment. He demanded they find their own career paths and achieve financial independence, applying the Mamba mentality to his private bookkeeping. He would invest in their ventures, but he would no longer subsidize their existence. This was a form of cold-blooded love, a parental-like intervention designed to force a sense of urgency into their lives. He was stripping away the safety net to see if they could fly, treating his siblings as he treated his teammates, subjecting them to the pressure required to turn carbon into diamonds. This era of his life was defined by the transition from a solitary assassin to a sophisticated ruler. He had learned that the most effective way to exert power was through the orchestration of others, whether it was the tactical synchronization with Gassel or the forced independence of his family. He moved through the world with an icy, economic rationalism, his every interaction calculated to maximize the output of the people around him. He sat in the locker room, the sounds of the Spanish language still echoing in his mind, his eyes fixed on the championship banners he had reclaimed. He had purged the shame of 2008 and restructured his world to ensure that his dominance was not merely a physical act, but a systemic reality. He looked at the faces of his sisters during their infrequent meetings and saw the friction of their new reality, a reflection of the same uncompromising pressure he had applied to himself since the age of 6. He had won back the kingdom, and in doing so, he had ensured that everyone within his orbit understood the price of being a Bryant. The year 2013 represented the beginning of a biological and domestic apocalypse for Bryant. On a spring evening against the Golden State Warriors, the physical machinery that had sustained his predatory existence for 2 decades finally experienced a catastrophic structural failure. The snap of his Achilles tendon was not merely an injury, it was the audible death of his athletic prime. Yet, it was in this moment of total physical bankruptcy that the Mamba persona achieved its final, quasi-religious form. While his nervous system registered a shock that would have incapacitated a lesser man, Bryant's primary concern was the mechanical completion of his duty. He limped to the free-throw line, his face a mask of sweating, agonizing stasis, and converted 2 foul shots on a severed heel. This was the apotheosis of his philosophy, a demonstration that the will was not a passenger to the body, but its absolute master. He did not leave the floor on a stretcher. He walked off under his own power, a deliberate act of defiance against the mortality of his own flesh. While he fought to reconstruct his body, His domestic foundations were undergoing a simultaneous legalistic collapse. The tension with Joe and Pamela Bryant, which had simmered for a decade, reached a frozen breaking point when his parents attempted to auction hundreds of his personal artifacts, early jerseys, championship rings, and high school trophies, without his consent. To Bryant, this was not a dispute over memorabilia. It was a forensic violation of his history. He viewed the attempt to monetize his legacy as the ultimate betrayal of the athletic sanctity they had once instilled in him. He responded with the same cold-blooded precision he used against defensive rotations, initiating a public lawsuit against his own parents. The litigation was a study in emotional detachment, a series of sterile court filings that effectively turned his biological roots into legal adversary. Although a settlement was eventually reached, featuring a formal public apology from his parents, the repair was purely cosmetic. The bridge back to his childhood in Italy and Philadelphia was effectively demolished, leaving Bryant in a state of self-imposed high-altitude orphanhood. The final chapter of his professional life was a slow-motion requiem. By 2016, the biological debt of 20 seasons had become unpayable. In his open letter, Dear Basketball, he articulated the internal schism that now defined his existence. His mind was still capable of the obsession, but his body had become a fragile, unwilling vessel. The farewell tour was a paradox of adulation and physical suffering, culminating in a final night at the Staples Center against the Utah Jazz. The performance was an irrational, 60-point explosion that defied every metric of aging and injury. He moved through the game as if he were channeling the ghosts of his younger self, a final exhibition of the Black Mamba's capacity to override the limitations of biology. Every shot was a punctuation mark on a 20-year sentence of excellence. As the final whistle blew, the arena was consumed by a collective, deafening reverence. Bryant stood at center court, the sweat glistening on his face like a second skin, his eyes scanning the rafters where his jerseys would soon hang. The 60 points were not a celebration, but a final, exhausting demand for respect from a game he was no longer physically permitted to play. He had spent his life attempting to outrun the silence of his own limitations, and in this final act, he had achieved a temporary, spectacular victory. He walked toward the tunnel for the last time, his hand raised in a gesture that was part blessing and part farewell, the heavy weight of his career finally settling into the stillness of history. The man was leaving the court, but the totem he had built out of his own suffering remained, a permanent fixture in the architecture of the city he had conquered and the sport he had redefined. The post-professional existence of Kobe Bryant was not a retirement, but a systemic pivot into a new theater of dominance. He moved from the physical hardwood to the conceptual landscape of Granity Studios, seeking to apply the same industrial rigor to storytelling that he had once applied to the mid-range jumper. He was no longer a player. He was an architect of narrative. In 2018, this transition reached a state of cultural validation when he stood on the stage of the Dolby Theater to accept an Academy Award for his animated short, Dear Basketball. To the world, it was a celebrity crossover. To Bryant, it was a forensic proof of concept. It demonstrated that the Mamba mentality was a portable technology of excellence, capable of conquering the creative arts with the same cold-blooded efficiency as a playoff series. This period was also defined by a softening of his internal fortress. He spent months in solitary obsession, learning to play Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata on the piano by ear, a feat of cognitive endurance performed as a private romantic offering to Vanessa. The man who had once refused to defer to teammates was now finding a quiet, rhythmic peace in the precision of the keys, translating his relentless focus into a language of delicate nocturnal beauty. This evolution of self found its most profound expression in the emergence of the Mamba Sports Academy. Bryant transitioned from the apex predator of the league to the master instructor of a new generation. The primary beneficiary of this shared intelligence was his daughter, Gianna. In the role of a coach and a father, Bryant discovered a version of the game that was stripped of its commercial cynicism. He became the public face of the Girl Dad movement, a cultural shift that emphasized the legitimacy and ferocity of female athletics. On the courts of the academy, he coached Gianna with the same technical scrutiny his father had once applied to him in the darkened rooms of Rieti. He was passing on the genetic and tactical code, teaching her the geometry of the triple threat and the psychology of the endgame. In these moments, the predatory isolation of the Black Mamba was replaced by a collaborative legacy. He was no longer playing for his own immortality. He was investing in hers, ensuring that the fire he had cultivated in the cold Pennsylvania mornings would burn in a new, more empathetic light. The conclusion arrived on a Sunday morning in January 2020, a day defined by a thick, suffocating fog that erased the horizon of Calabasas. The journey to a youth basketball game became the final transit of a life lived at a terminal velocity. The helicopter crash that claimed the lives of Bryant, Gianna, and 7 others was a catastrophic rupture in the global cultural fabric. The news did not merely report a death. It announced the sudden, violent removal of a pillar of modern willpower. In the hours and days that followed, the world entered a state of collective, televised mourning. The Staples Center became a cathedral of grief, its exterior draped in purple and gold as thousands of strangers gathered to witness the absence of the man who had defined their city for 2 decades. The silence was not merely for the loss of an athlete, but for the loss of a shared ideal, the belief that human will could indefinitely delay the onset of the inevitable. The legacy of Kobe Bryant survived the wreckage, detaching itself from the mortality of the man to become a permanent psychological infrastructure. His 2 jerseys, the number 8 and the number 24, hung in the rafters as dualistic monuments to his evolution. From the arrogant, explosive apprentice to the calculated, philosophical ruler, the Mamba mentality ceased to be a personal brand and became a global syntax for the pursuit of perfection. He had successfully completed the transition from a person to a symbol, a secular saint of the relentless. In the quiet gymnasiums across the world, where the lights flicker on at 4 in the morning, his presence remains an invisible driving force. The boy from Italy, the exile of Philadelphia, and the king of Los Angeles had finally achieved a state of absolute stasis. The game continued, the ball thudding rhythmically against the floor in the silence of the morning. But the shadow lengthening across the court now belonged to a ghost whose influence was no longer bounded by the clock or the whistle. He had finally left the floor, but the lights in the arena were never turned off.